So let's go. Hello and good morning to all. My name is Roland Honziker. I'm the Director for Sustainable Buildings and Cities here at the WBCSD. And I will give a short introduction on the Cities and Mobility program briefing, in particular the two projects that are running in this program on transforming the urban mobility and transforming the built environment. And then we will go into a moderated discussion about why and how cities and business need to collaborate on the urgent transformation we have in both these sectors and beyond to work on this sustainability challenges of cities. So before we go into the program, I'll start with a few housekeeping issues. First of all the meetings are Chatham House rules. So please do use social media, but only talk about the content. Do not attribute any of that content to individual speakers. Also, all our meetings are run under antitrust rules. So please do refrain from discussing any issues around pricing or discounts, bid strategies, group boycotts, customer and market issues, output decisions, or future capacity additions and reductions. Some housekeeping instructions. We have muted everyone as a default. We do ask you to turn on your video if you are able to, because during the discussion, we will switch off the slides and then it is nice to see each other. Please do add the full name and your company into the window of the Zoom. All sessions are recorded, and if you miss any other session, you can watch them still until the end of this week on the platform. We also encourage you to use the chat function if you have any questions to the panel or overall, and we'll do our best to, if we are not able to bring them into the discussion, we'll reply in the chat itself. In order to achieve Vision 2050, WBCSD structures its program into these 6 strategic areas, from food and nature to people, circular economy, climate and energy, and cities and mobility, as well as at the heart, redefining value. This briefing today is about the work we do in the Cities and Mobility program. So I will briefly give you an update of the 2 projects we are running in this program area. Transforming the built environment. We often refer to the 3 challenges of the 40%. The built environment is responsible for 40% of global energy-related greenhouse gas emissions. It consumes about 40% of global materials, and it creates 40% of waste streams. So these are the multiple challenges of this system, and it is a very fragmented value chain, which is very project-focused and short-term and cost-focused. So it is difficult to create an overall systemic approach and work holistically with all the actors in this chain. So in WBCSD, we provide a global platform to companies from along the whole value chain to work together. The companies range from material manufacturers to construction, to design, to development and investment, as well as end users, to work together on tackling these changes. And often our members refer to being a coalition of the willing. So how do we work together to change the practices in this sector and work with others? What is very important for us is to engage the demand side, especially when we look at carbon. A lot of carbon gets emitted during material manufacturing and also during the use phase, but the influence is along the value chain, and in particular with those who design, those who finance, those who develop and occupy buildings. And so we need to understand how we can work together and drive that demand for more sustainable built assets up the value chain. So we provide a platform for learning, for knowledge sharing to our members in the areas of net zero carbon, circularity, but also looking at nature going forward. And we offer a platform for unlocking the enablers. For example, digitalization, finance, and this was introduced very well this morning in the plenary by Ellie Tang. Ultimately, it's the capital markets who also need to provide the pressure for the sector to change, and end users. So for example, WBCSD member companies and their global assets are also a major potential force for this sector to change. And cities, where regulatory requirements, but also procurement is driving change for this sector. On transforming urban mobility, we know that the next 30 years will see about a tripling of passenger and freight mobility in terms of kilometers traveled. And this sector is responsible for the fastest growing emissions in terms of greenhouse gas, as well as causing fatalities and air pollution in cities. So again, we need to change this paradigm, and it needs also coordinated action across different sectors, across stakeholders, cities, citizens, and businesses. Now, we manage in the Transforming Urban Mobility program 3 focus areas on decarbonization, on digitalization, and on behavior change. On decarbonization, we guide companies towards electric vehicle adoption, creating frameworks for faster deployment of charging infrastructure. On digitalization, we help cities and policymakers adopt data-driven solutions for urban mobility in order to reduce traffic and pollution and increase efficiency, safety, and accessibility. And on behavior change, we support companies in implementing sustainable corporate mobility policies that help them to lower their Scope 3 emissions and costs. These are the 2 projects, and for a wider overview, I invite you to go into the media section of the networking platform, where you can scroll down to Cities and Mobility, and you will find 2 pre-recorded program briefings for more information on each project. Now, I would like to introduce our excellent panel for today, because we would like to focus the conversation on why and how cities and business need to work together more closely, more strategically, to tackle the challenges in these sectors. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Dame Jo da Silva as our moderator. Jo, you are the Global Sustainable Development Director for Arup. You're a civil and structural engineer, and you have worked on many infrastructure projects across Asia, Europe, Africa, and you founded the international development arm of Arup, for which early this year you have received knighthoods. So you are today a Dame Commander of the British Empire. It is our great pleasure, Jo, to have you with us, and I will hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roland. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm delighted to be moderating this session with a really very impressive panel to have this discussion about how cities and businesses can come together collaboratively to solve the most pressing challenge of climate change. Here with us today, we have, and I'm going to introduce people in the order that they're going to speak, is Johnny Sadler, who is the Deputy Director of the Manchester Climate Change Agency. In that role, Johnny is responsible for the development of the climate change policy, strategy, programs, partnerships, communications that contribute to climate change in Manchester, which has a population of about 500,000 and almost 20,000 businesses. I'm also delighted that Pamela Juven from C40 has been able to join us. Pamela is the head of the City Business Climate Alliance, which she'll tell you a little bit more about, which is a collaboration with WBCSD. And then from the private sector, we have Roy Antic, who currently is employed by Stora Enso, which is a leading provider of renewable solutions in packaging, biomaterials and wooden structures. But previously, Roy worked for Skanska, which is a leading development and construction company. And prior to that, was part of the World Economic Forum's heading up the engineering and construction, which is, I think, where we came across each other about a decade ago. And last but not least, Eric Grab, who is the Vice President of Strategic Anticipation and Innovation, which I think is the most wonderful job title at Michelin. And he's responsible for creating the ecosystem for innovation and bringing together more than 200 companies. And I'm sure he'll tell you a bit more about that. So welcome to you all. Just very briefly to set the scene, the topic today is the real challenge of how are we going to decarbonize our cities? And that is about decarbonizing the cities that exist today, but it's also building the cities of tomorrow so that they contribute to a net zero world. You know, everyone really has a role to play in this. Each of us as individuals, as consumers, businesses, and city governments. And it is going to require a real collaborative effort. Arup is a global design, engineering, and business consultancy firm. We specialize in the built environment and have done for 75 years. And we realize that we can work with individual clients on individual projects, but actually what's needed is real systems transformation. And we are working closely with Roland and his team at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, because that offers the opportunity to collaborate across the value chain. And for the last decade, we've been collaborating with C40, initially on Deadline 2020, which was set the scene for the climate action plans that they've then pioneered in multiple cities. But why the need for collaboration? You know, organizations like C40 are working very effectively with governments across the world, encouraging them to create climate action plans. And those plans are vital for building consensus across the city. But they generate between 50 and 100 actions, things that need doing in order to tackle climate change. And those actions require a diverse range of actors to implement them. And not just to deliver particular things, but to create the enabling environment in terms of policy, in terms of finance, in terms of communications. And so, you know, cities can't do this alone. They need to be reaching out to businesses, and we need to be overcoming, you need to be identifying what are the challenges to closer collaboration between cities and businesses, and how do we overcome those challenges. Johnny, I'd like to begin with you and starting with a real city's perspective. Your remit in Manchester is broad. It covers all those bits of the jigsaw I just mentioned. What are the key priorities in Manchester in your climate action plan? And where do you see the business community in Manchester playing a role?
Sure. Thank you very much, Joe, and also thanks to colleagues at WBCD. It's a real pleasure to be with you all this morning. Let me just start very briefly and set the scene in terms of where we are from a Manchester and a city's perspective more widely. I would define the last 10 years of climate action at city level as being a period of voluntary endeavour. We've had the luxury of picking and choosing those areas where we've wanted to take action, perhaps based on those that were easiest or offered some of the best socioeconomic co-benefits. And that's been fine to get us moving. But this next period for me is where things get really exciting, but they also get a lot more challenging. So the opportunity to manage off the table those more difficult topics, that opportunity is not with us anymore. So everything's on the table, and this has got to be a period about full transparency about the full scope of our emissions and the actions that we need to take at a city level to address them. So in Manchester, we've committed to action in relation to 3 bits of our carbon footprint: direct emissions from buildings and ground transport, which most cities are now doing. We've also committed to action on our indirect or consumption-based emissions. Now, based on work that colleagues at Arup and C40 did a couple of years ago, we estimate that they're about 60% higher than our direct emissions. They're significant. And the third area that we've included is all emissions from all flights from Manchester Airport. we don't think it's helpful to ignore emissions from Manchester Airport, which is a significant international airport. So those are the three bits of the city scope. We're also committed to increasing our resilience to a changing climate. And what all that translates into is the need to act in 6 areas. You will see versions of this in most city climate action plans. Buildings, both existing and new, energy, transport, food, the things we buy and throw away, and green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. So 6 topics I'm sure that are very familiar to colleagues on this call, but you will increasingly see them come through in other city climate action plans. So, you know, I've said that we're moving into this period now of kind of, you know, non-negotiables in terms of what the scope and the scale of ambition is. And your question, Joe, around what's the role for business in here? I would say there are 3 things that we particularly want to see businesses in Manchester and elsewhere doing. 1, get your own house in order, sort out your own operational footprint. That's relatively straightforward. I know it's not easy, but it's relatively straightforward. Second thing I would say is influence your supply chains, customers, tenants, football fans, passengers, worshippers, theatre goers, all those people that you might interact with as an organisation. And then thirdly is one we quite often forget, which is to proactively ask for help when it's needed. I think some organisations, probably not those on this call, may fall into the habit of kind of waiting for local or national government to intervene on their behalf. What we very much encourage our colleagues in Manchester to do is be proactive, do everything that you can within the existing policy and regulatory framework, but when you hit a particular structural or systemic barrier, ask for help. And there will be a number of organisations around you who want to be proactive in working with you to address that barrier. So those are 3 things I would say are really important in the conversations we have with our businesses. And I'll just finish with a little bit around how we organise our relationship with businesses and organisations in Manchester. 3 years ago, we set up something called the Manchester Climate Change Partnership. It brings together 70 organisations from across 11 sectors with collective responsibility for over 20% of the city's direct carbon emissions. So what that does is it gives me, as somebody who works for a climate change agency, a direct relationship with over 1/5 of the city's emissions and an ability to influence some of the other 80% through supply chains, football fans, etc., as I've mentioned. Now, we are being really encouraged to see that quite a lot of what we've done, we're doing right, but there's a lot of scope for further improvement. And that's where I'll maybe just tee up my colleague, Pamela, who'll talk a little bit more about this initiative, but really pleased to say that Manchester is one of 8 cities now participating in the City Business Climate Alliance to help us, A, grow the partnerships, we get to more like 50% of the city's emissions, and B, put in place a new zero carbon business programme that will support Manchester businesses to join the race to zero. And I'll leave it there, Joe.
Johnny, thank you very much for that really inspiring and clear insight into what Manchester are doing. And it sounds like, you know, you're doing as much as you can on your own and turning to organisations like the C40 to link you up with your peers. Pamela, could you tell us a bit more about the Cities Business Climate Alliance and who is involved and what your partner cities are looking to achieve by joining up?
Absolutely. Thank you very much for this question, Joe. Happy to be with you all today and delighted to be with Johnny in particular, who's one of the city points of contact we work with. So as we've already said, the CBCA, City Business Climate Alliance, is a joint initiative of C40, CDP, and WBCSD. And we really operate as a network of cities and businesses, a 2-tier network, the idea being to accelerate climate action implementation. We've already said a lot on this topic, but just as a reminder, our research has shown that the collaboration with the private sector, or as a matter of fact, the lack thereof, is one of the 6 main barriers to climate action implementation at city level. And we also know that a large part of the emissions that are occurring within city boundaries And the actions that need to be taken to address these are linked to private sector owned or managed assets. So it's really crucial for cities to work with business in order to achieve the priority targets that they've identified in their climate action plans. So let's go back to CBCA. At the moment, we work on 2 levels and with 3 different types of cities. So on a local level, first of all, we have selected, as Johnny said, a first cohort of 8 cities that we're directly supporting in either setting up or in some cases further developing platforms for collaboration with locally based businesses. So within the cohort, we have obviously Manchester, but also Stockholm, Durban, Tel Aviv, New York, Dallas, Vancouver, and Lisbon. So a wide range of cities. And the idea is to have them develop these trusted, non-commercial spaces to facilitate long-term engagement with locally based businesses and also raise ambition, obviously. But on top of this, on a global level, we have also formed a wider network that includes 2 other categories of cities. So we have fellow cities, cities who've already developed successful platforms for collaboration with the private sector, who we've invited to join the network so that they could share their experience. And we also have network cities who joined the network to learn from their peers, because ultimately this is what the network is about. It's meant to facilitate peer-to-peer support, but also knowledge sharing and more generally advocacy around city business collaboration. And there's actually a 4th category of stakeholders that we're looking to engage, and this event certainly feels like the right place to say this. We're also looking to recruit global businesses to join the network in order to provide a business perspective in our discussions, our events, and maybe even act as ambassadors for the CBCA in the business community. Now, to answer the second part of your question, Joe, so what our partner cities are trying to achieve, there are a few things to highlight here. Obviously, as I said, the idea is for them to work with the private sector in order to achieve their climate action targets. So to bridge the gap between their emission reduction goals and the implementation of projects. So in this context, obviously, being able to access businesses' expertise and implementation capacity is absolutely crucial. However, this also means that our cities are interested in supporting businesses, and you've seen that with Johnny's remarks. So they want to understand businesses' needs when it comes to changing the way they operate, greening their activities. They want to understand how they can create an enabling environment. And that goes from setting up new regulations to, say, installing charging points in strategic locations, or sharing data, or in some cases, even co-developing new ideas.
Thank you very much, Pamela. And really looking forward to seeing those 8 cities, how they can really drive this agenda forwards. I'd like to turn now to Eric and Roy. Johnny, in his remarks, said that the action plan for Manchester, and it is similar for many cities globally. 2 of the main areas that they need to address are the built environment, buildings and construction, and urban mobility, which are the 2 key themes of the WBCSD program. Eric, could I start with you? I mean, you're leading WBCSD's work on transforming urban mobility. How are you responding to these challenges in cities? And what would you like to see in the way of greater collaboration or changes to the enabling environment within cities? I think you're on mute, Eric.
Yeah. Now I'm back. Thank you, Joe. Let's be clear. In fact, we all know around this table that we should accelerate on decarbonization, digitalization, and commuting behavior change, which are the 3 topics we prioritize within the WBCSD, as you know. The question for me is, how can we accelerate? How can we do things better than what we do in the past, and what should be changed to be able to accelerate? It's true, and Johnny and Pamela said it, it's true that big corporation businesses are well positioned to deal with this huge transformation programs, and particularly in the urban mobility. Why? Well, because they are, developing advanced technologies. They can pass through the famous Death Valley, which is a key issue not only for startup companies. They have people on the field. They have scale-up capabilities, and they have obviously also financial capacities. So they are well positioned. The problem is they don't know, in many cases, how to work together. And let's be clear, we should first, as big corporation, learn how to work together. And that's why WBCSD initiatives are so important. That's why our initiative you mentioned in your introduction, Joe, called Moving On, and that's why you have this background behind me. This Moving On ecosystem are so important, and I will come back on the complementarity of both. So why is it not so easy to work together? Because we don't have the same innovation culture. We don't have the same time horizons. We don't have the same innovation toolbox or methods. So just that, to align this is already a challenge. So concretely, there are some prerequisites from my point of view if we want to increase the iteration and cooperation between cities and big corporation or business in general. The first one is, as I just said, we have to learn how to work together. Because what I said about the culture, the time horizons, and the toolbox is even worse when you add the other partners or the other stakeholders of the ecosystem, which you need, by the way. Startup companies, international organizations, public authorities, not only cities, but government or things like that. So first, we have to learn how to work together, and it's not obvious. Secondly, we have to show the examples. We have to do our homework. And that's why we are quite involved within the WBCSD with commuting behavior change, for example. Because, dealing with rush hours and dealing with congestion in cities, it's mainly our problem because our employees are going out, going in the city, and we have to manage that. So we have to show the example. We also have to better understand city demands because cities' demands are different. And I'm sure that Pamela will agree with that. I mean, if you compare Stockholm, Manchester, Paris, Montreal, Boston, cities with whom we are working currently, I mean, they are different. Just because they have winters in some cases, they have bridges, they have, rivers in the cities. So it's different. So we have to take the time to understand the latent needs, not only the explicit needs, but also the latent needs from the cities and from their citizens. So this is a very important part on which we are spending a lot of time within Moving On and also within WBCSD, as you know, to both understand and validate the future demand, which means we have to develop, and that's another prerequisite, we have to develop prototyping and experimenting capacities, because nobody knows upfront who and what should be done, in fact, if I refer to my experience, in details, and what type of technology we should adopt or not, or mix together. So we better prototypes, we better experiment. And during this phase, we have a chance to iterate and to exchange and to increase the level of trust, which is key in this type of initiative. If you don't develop time or weeks after weeks a trust between the city and the big corporation, forget it. We won't make anything concrete and efficient together. And last but not least, if everything is validated, if the demand is understood, then we can think about building consortiums locally with the local partners, the local stakeholders also obviously included. And we can then address the demand and together with organizations like WBCSD and Moving On, which are complementary, because WBCSD is obviously much more focused on think. We are much more focused on do. So prototyping, experimenting, as I was saying, because we are only big corporation designed for that. So these are the prerequisites from my point of view. But I would be happy to listen to my colleagues here and to challenge me on these 4 or 5 prerequisites.
Yeah, Eric, well, certainly those prerequisites for collaboration resonate with my own experiences. and trust being the most important one. And someone's told me the other day that trust arrives on foot and flees on horseback.
Yeah.
I think that's very true.
But in fact,
Roy,
Joe, excuse me to interrupt you, but trust is not a question of knowing each other. It's much more. It's working together and developing a shared vision about what should be done, which is key.
Absolutely. Roy, can I turn to you? In the work that Arup did with C40 on the future of consumption in a 1.5 degree world, we were looking at the role cities play in terms of reducing consumption-based emissions, relating to things that we buy, like food and clothes and electronic goods, but also importantly, the buildings that we occupy. And the built environment contributes to 40% of global emissions, which is very much more significant than other sectors such as aviation, etc. Could you share a bit more about what you're doing with WBCSD in terms of their Transforming the Built Environment program?
Absolutely. And first of all, I'd like to just quickly start by saying hello on my behalf as well. Thank you for tuning in. And I'd like to sort of undersign what Eric just mentioned. I think that's also very true in the built environment, a very complicated value chain where very different sort of motives exist along the value chain. And we talk about collaboration, but there are the effects of true collaboration, I have seen very little. And in fact, it boils down to building this trust very, very early on in this pre-competitive landscape. Now, when it comes to the built environment, Joe, you mentioned it, Roland mentioned it, 40%. I just wanted to break it down in that 29% is sort of associated with the building operations. But one thing that I think deserves more attention and is very much sort of a topic of attention of the program is the 11% that's associated with or is called embodied carbon and associated with making decisions early on in the process on materials. And I think the approach that we need to try to tackle jointly is how do we integrate that into decision making? Because unlike the operational aspect and some of the end of life aspects, it's this material choice that locks in emissions that we cannot mitigate anymore. And I think we need to try and come together through initiatives such as CBAC to address exactly that and to find this trust to work together and to see if we can find an approach that is material neutral or non-discriminative to drive true innovation, or perhaps not even true innovation. I think all companies have innovation high on their agenda, but innovation for the right use and for the right sort of customers, in this sense, the cities, to address this sort of embodied carbon aspect of the whole life cycle. And one of the ways that you could start looking at this is to start incorporating reference values or limit values that represent a building typologies in a certain local geography, to start driving and aligning the value chain from city all the way down to material manufacturing around the 40, and this case the 11% being part of that. And I really do believe that we have a huge operation if we can overcome this issue of aligning the value chain, and if we can build this trust in a pre-competitive landscape. I mean, the cities have so much leverage, and at the same time we have so much capacity to innovate. And if you look at the city's points of leverage, I mean, the cities are huge, large developers and users. They know what buildings look like, what they need to look like. They can drive this process efficiently. But I'd also like to say that, obviously, is that they're a regulator. They do have large control over sort of the built environment in terms of zoning, permits, regulations, guidelines, etc. But then perhaps the aspect least sort of perhaps considered in all of this is that cities are also a large landowner. And as a landowner, they often sit on top of the value chain. We talk about investors, developers being the ones driving the value chain. Yes, but they need land. And I think there's also an important point of intervention. If we can start to come together about how do we align the value chain, how do we include this notion of embodied carbon, and how can we start to early on affect decision making along the value chain? I think then we have a really, really good scope and bring sort of the innovation capacity of the private sector and the demand in the cities and the leadership of the cities together around this space. I think that would be really really great.
Thank you, Roy, so much. And it's immensely refreshing to hear from everybody on the call that there is a real desire for collaboration, and that the role of business is not just providing funding, but actually providing creativity and innovation. And I think, having lived all of us through the last year of COVID, and so much has changed, we are in a wonderful moment in time where we're fearless, really, of change. It's in a very different environment to where we were all psychologically about a year ago. I'd like to just, we've got about 5 more minutes left, and I'd just like to give the panel an opportunity to comment on what each other have said. But Pamela, I'd just sort of like to start with you, because the C40 has done incredibly well in terms of creating sort of peer-to-peer environments for exchange between cities. And now you're trying to create that same kind of thing within cities. And I was interested in your reaction to Roy and Eric's comments about, creating an ecosystem for innovation, and really moving on from the challenges of simply operational energy to addressing, consumption-based emissions, or embodied energy, depending on what we want to call it today. You're on mute, Pamela.
I just realized. Thank you, Joe. No, absolutely. And I was really interested in hearing from Eric and Roy, and I did note that trust is a word that came back quite often. So good thing that this is exactly what we're trying to do with CBCA. And I know that I didn't mention sectors in my previous remarks, but we know, having already worked for a few months with our cohort cities, that obviously mobility and buildings are among the main focus areas that they want to work on. So in terms of building that trusted environment, I think we already have a really interesting example in Stockholm, which is one of the first cohort cities to have launched a CBCA supported platform called Climate Pact Delivers. They're focusing on sustainable freight and deliveries. They already have, I think, 9 businesses on board, including IKEA or IBM Sweden. And that's exactly what they're doing. They're doing one-on-one meetings with these companies, giving them access to city experts and having in-depth conversations about how the city can also create that enabling environment and build a trusted relationship that will ultimately lead to the co-creation of solutions. So that's obviously an example from the mobility sector, but the very same thing applies in the built environment. And we know that some of our cohort cities will be really focusing their efforts on this. And some of them are signatories of some of our declarations at C40, including the Clean Construction Declaration that focuses on embodied emissions. So we're really looking forward to working with them on this specific topic.
That's great, Pamela, thank you.
No, the example
of Pamela, to respond.
Yeah, no, the example of Pamela is interesting about Stockholm, because if I understand well, Pamela, you are not only focusing on people transportation, but also on good transportation, which is a comment or a remark I make all the time. It's perhaps sometimes more easier to begin with good transportation, because people transportation is also a politic issue. So I think that we have a lot of opportunities with good transportation, and we can do a lot right now to optimize transportation, a good transportation, which will be anyway a must, because with the development of the pandemic's situations, we have seen this goods entering cities exploding, and we have to manage that anyway. So just a comment on that, but yes, it's a good opportunity to begin with.
Can I just come in with a brief point, Joe? I think as well as the point around trust, that was really well made by Eric and Roy. The other word I heard a couple of times was alignment. I think we've seen over the last 12 months something really exciting happen in terms of now a global alignment in relation to the Paris Agreement. So the UN campaign Race to Zero that now gives us a much clearer definition of where we need to be going as cities, as businesses, as investors, as universities. And when I test that kind of initiative with colleagues in Manchester, they really welcome that level of consistency. They know that whether they're working in Manchester, Birmingham, London, Stockholm, Berlin, wherever, the standards that they'll be working to will be the same in other parts of the world. So that's, I'm a real big advocate for Race to Zero and a number of the initiatives under the We Mean Business coalition. So I'm sure a number of colleagues on the call will already be signed up, but if you're not, a really big plug for those initiatives. I think the more momentum we build behind them, the easier it is going to be for the next wave of businesses and the next wave to get on board.
Absolutely, Johnny. I couldn't agree with you more. And I thought that your 3-point plan for businesses in your city of, get your own house in order, be a responsible business, sign up to Race to Zero, join the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and look at their new membership criteria. But then, the extent of business, the influence that we have as individual businesses on our supply chains is really important. And I think you were very strongly reminded us that as businesses, we also need to remind ourselves that we have an influence on cities. We have the ability to influence policy change. And so businesses should be collaborating together and speaking up more, identifying those barriers and seeking to overcome them. I'm completely agree on the trust. I love the fact, Eric, you brought up experimentation, the courage to try new things and do things differently, and also the urgent need to accelerate what we're doing. We are in a crisis. As Antonio Guterres said the other day, there is no vaccine for climate change. We're not going to find that silver bullet. It's going to be what we achieve in terms of getting to net zero will be the result of hard graft and real collaborative effort. And I think WBCSD are doing a fantastic job of bringing together diverse actors such as all of you into forums such as this. So thank you, Roland. And we're all on side for your work going forwards. And I hope that some of you in the audience who are not participating in this particular part of WBCSD's program might choose to do so.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, for that shout out to join us. Indeed, I'd like to encourage all of you as well. I think what we've heard are all aspects we're trying to tackle, also through the City Business Climate Alliance, trust, aligned vision, ecosystem of innovation. Yeah, I think it's important that we move together forward. So to me, it's only closing the event, unfortunately, but we can speak further. We have more events coming up these 2 days. First of all, just bringing up the closing slide. You can, of course, consult all the other sessions. Do give us feedback with the 2-minute survey you can take and look at the other agendas. We will have later today still a session on the business role in sustainable mobility. It's in the Americas time zone, so a bit later for Europe. And tomorrow we'll focus on the role corporates can have through their own real estate assets to drive the change in the built environment as well. And I think very interesting also for the CBCA, City Business Climate Alliance, to look at some of the power we can bring from the real estate side. So please do let us know if you have any further ideas how CBCA should help us. And as Pamela said, if you consider becoming a partner at the global level to help us move some of this work forward, you are very much welcome to do so. Before I forget, we also have in the networking area a table set aside at 3 p.m. CT this afternoon to talk about the built environment in particular. So that's an informal discussion for those who have more questions. And otherwise, as I said, there's a few more sessions on these topics between today and tomorrow. Thank you all, Joe, Roy, Johnny, Pamela, and Eric for sharing your insights, and we'll stay connected. Thank you so much.